Welcome to Christ the Center, your weekly conversation of Reformed theology. My name is Camden Bucey. This is episode number 825, and I'm in Libertyville, Illinois, just on the heels of the Reformed Forum Theology Conference. And as we record this, I'm heading to the Presbyterian Scholars Conference tomorrow, but you'll hear this, Lord willing, a few days after that's concluded. But it's exciting times, and I have with me a good friend who is also just here for the Reformed Forum Conference, Lane Tipton, professor, I should say fellow, same kind of thing. We don't have regular courses. So fellow of Biblical and Systematic Theology here at Reformed Forum, as well as pastor of Trinity OPC in Easton, PA. Welcome back, Lane. It's good to see you.
Camden, great to be here as always.
Yes, sir. We've got a fun conversation lined up today. We're going to get to a Voss group soon enough. We're not doing one today. Hopefully we can do one in the next couple of weeks and stay on our relative schedule, relatively monthly. But we do have another publication that we wanted to take a moment to speak. So this started as a podcast episode back on episode 700. So that's 2.5 years ago. And now it's come right back around to a booklet. So we're going to today speak about Unfolding Redemption, Exploring the History and Order of Salvation, which is co-authored by the two of us. It's a 52-page booklet and really great. I mean, we could have sat on it and expanded it perhaps into a full book, but we wanted to get it out there. Perhaps someday it will be part of a larger collection if we have other essays or things that are on the topic, maybe put them into a collected book. But for now, we've got a beautiful booklet. We have it printed up with just the best paper, this Cougar paper. We got to love that. Really, really high quality stuff. I think it's, I don't want to pat myself on the back, but I like how it's typeset.
It is beautiful. I'm with you 100%. It's beautiful.
Well, you do what you like, so maybe not everyone else will like it. I like it, but the printer did a fantastic job, and I worked very closely with our printer rep, Kathy Edwards. Get a shout out to Kathy Edwards at Graphic Color Printing in New Berlin, Wisconsin. She's been with us for several years now, doing all sorts of good stuff for us. Recently, our conference name badges, our business cards. They print our magazine, all sorts of great stuff. So love Kathy. Throw Kathy some business if you guys are looking for anything printing. They can do almost anything. We don't get our books printed there. We go through a book company, either Versa Press or Sheridan usually. But if you need anything, pretty much anything else on paper, go to Graphic Color Printing. That's an unpaid sponsorship. Not a sponsorship, just a shout out of my gratitude. For Graphic Color and Kathy Edwards. You'll love it. If anyone needs a direct contact info, check the website or send in to mail@reformedforum.org. I'll get that, or the community.reformedforum.org, and I'll get that info off to you. Lane, before we pick back up with this and the subject matter of this book, and we're going to have a screaming deal on a 10-pack for you, half off, shipped.
Oh, wow.
So we'll get info on that. That'll probably just be on the website. You won't need a code, I don't think. So take a look at the website to get copies of this book shipped to the U.S. for half off. But I'd like to get some follow-up, Lane, on the Reformed Forum Conference. I'm just about ready to finalize the recordings of the lectures and get them published. Hopefully, by the time people will hear this, they'll already be available on YouTube. But another year is in the books. What were your thoughts this time around?
Well, I believe that in the centennial of the publication of Christianity and Liberalism, people came out of the woodwork seeking to claim Machen. And I don't want to put a percentage on this, but of the percentage of people who did it, maybe 5 or 10%, maybe more, I don't want to be a curmudgeon, actually understand him and embrace him and practice militant Calvinism and militant Presbyterianism the way Machen did. And I'll tell you what I loved about our conference. We had a pretty wide range of lectures. You and Jim and Daryl and me. And I really did feel like that if you listen to these lectures together and you reflect on Machen as a scholar, as a churchman, as a theologian, and you put him in his historical and doctrinal context, I really felt like this conference gave a unique and penetrating window into the heart of Machen. And, ranging from expositions that contextualize them to some of your material, Jim's material, wide-ranging applications of Machen interfacing with a pretty broad swatch of issues in theology and culture and philosophy and theology more broadly considered. It was a delightful conference, and the fellowship I thought was wonderful as always. And I always have super high expectations, Camden, but it did not disappoint me at all. I was thrilled about the conference as a whole.
Yeah, I was happy too. And different in a sense from some other years, but still of the same type and still within a trajectory.
Yeah.
So their attendance was high. We're really bumping up against the limits of what Hope Presbyterian Church in Grayslake can hold. People internally and externally wondering, what we're just going to keep doing the same thing every year. Well, maybe for the time being, but we also are looking at ways to do regional events. So I'll toss that out there if people are interested. We are entertaining potential options and invitations. So we did some meetups in December, one in Dallas, one in Atlanta. Those were wonderful. So if we are able to go to a region where there are a good amount of Reformed Forum listeners and students and do a meetup maybe on a Friday, do a Saturday seminar, in the morning, maybe into the early afternoon with a catered lunch or something simple or provided lunch, and then maybe to hang around some of the Reformed Forum folks to worship on Sunday at the church that would be hosting. We'd love to do that. Maybe do a Sunday school or somebody preach or just attend whatever the session desired. And those are things we're considering, and we'd perhaps like to do a couple of those per year because not everyone can make the trip all the way to Chicago. It's expensive. It's a lot of time and effort, but we were thankful for all the people that did. And we had, I don't even know the final count, but it was full. It was more than 100 for us. That's a lot for as niche as we are. And we had a great time. So I lectured a little bit on Machen and mythology, pretty broad pop level type of stuff, although getting into some of the weeds a little bit on the history of religion school and connections with Voss. Jim lectured on Barth, and that's germane, not because Machen dealt with Barth, but because Van Til was so linked up with Machen, and then Van Til carried on the critique that Machen laid out in Christianity and Liberalism in his book, Christianity and Barthianism, and the preceding book, The New Modernism. Lane obviously lectured and dealt quite a bit with Machen on the doctrine of God, which is also germane and applicable to some contemporary challenges. And Daryl spoke about some of the sources of J. Gresham Machen's realism and talked quite a bit about H.L. Mencken and others about Machen's skepticism and what that means for Christians and some other issues involved there. So very historically anchored, but yet doing some new things that you don't see other places. So there are lots of conferences, as you alluded to, Lane, about anyone and everyone talking about Machen. In fact, tomorrow I'll be speaking on a panel for this Presbyterian Scholars Conference on Christianity and Liberalism. And part of what I'm wondering, I guess I can let the cat out of the bag now because by this time it should already be done. But I only need, about 15 minutes or so. I think there's 4 or 5 of us doing this. And I kind of start my comments. I plan to begin my comments saying, everyone's been talking about this, at least in my circles. Well, what more can be said? And so, I'll recover some of the ground from my recent lecture on mythology, but then I'm going to talk more or less about Machen. Have we mythologized Machen? But I don't think so. But I since this is a group of Presbyterian scholars, I'm very interested to hear their thoughts on different ways of engaging and doing research and writing in the field. I'm not a trained historian. I guess technically our PhDs, Lane, are historical and theological studies. So we have had more historical theology and history than the average person. But I wouldn't consider myself an historian proper. That doesn't mean that we aren't historically aware or interested. It's just that's not my bread and butter. Systematic theology or dogmatics is, and biblical theology really. But so dealing with that, it's interesting to me, given my role as OPC historian, which doesn't mean I need to be the expert, but I'm ultimately responsible for the archives, for maintaining our distinctives, our story, our pilgrim identity, and being a cheerleader for that with the denomination to making sure we don't lose that. Nevertheless, what I do in terms of writing about Machen or Stonehouse or Van Til or doing all this other work, it has a different purpose in mind than being bare theology. History, just reporting facts. It's always need to be anchored to the truth and to what actually happened. However, some people will look at it and categorize the kind of stuff I do or the kind of stuff the OPC publishes as what's called denominational history. And some people, I'm not saying names, and I haven't heard this, face to face from anybody. They might look down their nose at it and maybe think of it as second class history or not even real history. It's, a more tame version of mythologizing. You see this key figure and his rough biography somehow serves a purpose that you want to employ, or serves a purpose that, is advancing your own purposes. So you employ this story and you basically create a superhero or a character or figure to advance your own ends, whether they be denominational importance or, in Machen, there's many of these things. There is a Machen myth, and I'm not saying it's made up or it's fictional, but there's something to be said about the story, which I think holds the OPC identity together in a unique way. It's something we have that very few denominations others have in the same way. So the question I'm raising to these scholars is, what's the difference and where's the line, if there is one, between a denominational history and a more academic history? And, are we guilty of mythologizing Machen? My answer to that is no, because I think there are other figures that here's the retort. So I don't want to give away the whole punchline, but here's the retort. If we are just mythologizing Machen, why has he had such a reception with the wider evangelical community? Whereas other people who were more influential than Machen at the time and more beloved have faded away, or just aren't as significant, widely speaking. Like, why does John Piper devote one of his annual biographies, about a decade or 15 years ago, to Machen? Why? Why are Baptists hosting conferences on Machen now? Whereas there were many other figures. Clarence McCartney. McCartney was a way bigger figure in some regards, and maybe you could debate what his social stock was relative to Machen at the time, but other figures like McCartney never left the PCUSA, or you end up with guys like Charles Erdman, who was personally a conservative, but much more friendly and moderate. I think Bradley Longfield said he was the most beloved Presbyterian of all in the 20s and 30s. So where are these guys? Why aren't they mythologized in the same way? So anyway, these are kinds of things to sketch out. And I think that it raises some interesting questions about the role and significance of Machen. But I'm with you, Lane. I think even though he has such a wide reception, sometimes it's nice to, the more people that love and read Machen, the better. That's my view. However, it is nice to spend time with and to hear people talking about Machen from the inside, people that have a long history with and experience with the tradition of Westminster Seminary, with the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. You're talking about Machen more as a father or a brother, rather than this guy over here that I like a lot, but I'm not daily part of this tradition. It'd be like me, Lane. I could become a scholar. I'm going to diminish what I just said by making this comparison, but I could become the world's expert on the late 70s and 80s Pittsburgh Steelers. But as a Bears fan, like, I'm never going to know it or feel it or live it the way that, someone like yourself or someone even from Pittsburgh, or, someone who's in that all the time will. Just like, the 2016 World Series for me as a Chicago Cubs fan has so much different meaning and connotation than somebody, like Bob Costas watching it from afar, who's a baseball expert, but not growing up a Cub fan. He's never going to live it or understand it the same way.
That's fair. Yeah. And just as a sidebar, I've never pretended to be an historian. I have historical interest, of course, but I'll tell you one thing that struck me about Machen's contribution, and one reason why I think he's easy to mythologize, as you put it. Not only were his critiques of liberalism incredibly incisive, and you're getting as close as you can get to an insider's exposition of them. He studied under Hermann. You can tell Machen read the primary sources and was intimately familiar with them. But what struck me was that a New Testament scholar was so dogmatically or theologically astute that his alternative to modern theological liberalism, or we'll just call it modernism, his alternative bears a perennial impress. The formulations that he made critiquing liberalism on its doctrines of God and man, particularly doctrine of God, is prescient. It's astonishingly relevant for the issues that have crept, as I said in my lecture, that have migrated from liberal pantheism into what I termed evangelical pantheism. So there's really something profoundly perennial about Machen. And I love the fact that someone with your historical aptitudes and theological interests is engaging this. I think it's going to pay wonderful dividends.
I think you're being a little too generous here, brother. But so I love what you're saying. It's interesting to me here. It just struck me, you get so many folks that might want to, especially you start doing this history on the Presbyterian conflict, and you see so many figures, and you see so many big names, and partly what the OPC, the PC of A, before that the Presbyterian Constitution Covenant Union, before that just the cantankerous folks who were upset about liberals. You end up with this reaction to a desire to be culturally significant. And you find that again in the OPC in the 1940s, where many people came out, but they're kind of were marketers in hiding, or they wanted to, guys like Edwin Ryan, Carl McIntyre left earlier, but J. Oliver Buswell. Leave McIntyre out of this, misspoke. But Ryan and Buswell are good examples, Ryan especially. But people in the 40s that were trying to change the OPC to become a more conservative version of the mainline, in the sense of it would be the premier church on the corner, the one that's culturally significant, culturally influential.
Yes.
The one that we read about in the papers, who is the church of record, in our day, when something happens in the news, who does a cable news station call to comment on the issue, that kind of thing.
Right. And
there was a battle with the Committee of Nine that the OPC eventually decided, by accepting Van Til and Murray Force Thompson's minority report, they decided that they were not interested in being the culturally influential church. They wanted to be faithful, but they didn't want to sacrifice a Reformed identity or confessional faithfulness in order to trade those things for influence, size, numbers, money, power, whatever it would be. Okay, so here's where this connects then to Machen, because that would have been 8-9 years later. But it's interesting to me, even backing up 20 years earlier from the Committee of Nine to the publication of Christianity and Liberalism, Machen's influence in many ways through that book. So that's another thing that Erdman didn't have, that Clarence McCartney didn't have, is a book like Christianity and Liberalism. But the thing that so many people say about that book is that they read it now 100 years later, and it feels like he's talking about our issues right now. There is this perennial nature to it. So in this unusual kind of ironic twist, the way that Machen, not because he sought it, but the way that Machen received name recognition, influence, and a perennial influence, that he's always in this conversation, is by going to the deep structures of this issue and exposing at root the unbelief in what he was addressing.
Yes.
And by doing that, he's at a substructure that doesn't change, whereas all the other things at the surface level, are the Heraclitean river moments, everything changes. But as they say, the cliche, the more things change, the more things stay the same. Really what Machen was addressing, he didn't do the flavor of the day error.
Yes.
He addressed the flavor of the day at the heart, at the root. And through that, oddly enough, became the figure that is remembered, whereas other people have passed away into the annals of history.
Well, and Camden, I won't do a lecture on this or name names, but we've seen in our contemporary environment within the last 5 years, seminaries that forego faithfulness on doctrinal matters like the doctrine of God and related issues, seeking cultural relevance. And the irony is that by forfeiting that doctrinal integrity and that rock-ribbed moral defense of theological orthodoxy in the quest for relevancy, they lose relevancy. And it's such an irony, I think, that those who are willing to cut the corners or sweep doctrinal error under the rug and pretend it doesn't exist for the sake of having influence, they lose the very thing that they're after, namely influence. And Machen is so helpful that way. I think that first generation, I call it Old Westminster, that first generation was so helpful because they attained influence and have quite the influence even still today, even though they weren't seeking it. They were seeking a better country, seeking faithfulness, seeking service of the church. And Machen, to me, I don't want to turn it into a moral tale. I don't want to engage in hagiography.
You're going to mythologize him.
I don't want to mythologize. I don't want to mythologize, but I'm afraid I'm about to. I'm just thankful for him and for that generation.
Sure.
And, my prayers that people who've lost their way today, seeking cultural influence and, and all that would turn back to those well-worn paths of faithfulness. So anyway, I don't want to impugn motives, but to let me connect some dots for people, because this is recent news as of a couple days ago. But I don't want to pile on, but this might sound like I'm piling on, but I really want to just make a contemporary touch point. You see some of the struggles recently, the PR struggles with the Gospel Coalition. Mm-hmm. And of recently they have been publishing things and then getting blowback and then retracting them. I think the most recent one had something to do with Taylor Swift, some comparison about Taylor Swift to what we can learn from Swiftians about the gospel or something like that. But just that model, like, we laugh, right? Like, it sounds like a joke. And then Babylon Bee makes a joke that and I don't follow Babylon Bee, but sometimes I see it popping up in my X stream. And they were talking about somebody publishing a Taylor Swift study Bible, but it's ridiculous. It's a joke, but it's like, at some point you stop and you wonder, it's like, wait, is that really happening? And it might. Yes.
But the point is, okay, I'm all for, let's expound the gospel. Let's expound the scriptures and try to speak the gospel into the lives of everyone.
Absolutely.
Let's find out how the work and the person of Christ applies in every person's life, and how Jesus is the Savior of all people, all types of people, all tongues, tribes, nations. And Christ comes, and this is what we'll get to a little today when we're talking about the order of salvation, at least, but the history of salvation, what Christ has done in history, in his person and work, his life, death, and resurrection, and ascension, and his perpetual intercession, meets everyone wherever they are. There's a way to do that. There's a way to emphasize the applicability, the immediacy, the sufficiency of the work of Christ, no matter what your personal or historical circumstances are.
Mhm.
The gospel is present and is needed wherever you are, and it addresses your ultimate needs. There's a way to do that and remain relevant and immediate without capitulating to just trying to turn the message of the Bible into some cultural artifact. Like the Bible is applicable and meaningful apart from trying to convey it in the terms of whatever the Swifty language is. I don't know. Like that's where it gets over the line, where you're just trying to, then it starts to turn into this kind of, I'm going to give you your medicine, but I'm going to wrap it in bacon first kind of thing. Right. Like, and I just don't see the apostles doing that kind of stuff at all.
No, they
And
didn't.
they didn't create cultural centers. They were aware. They address cultural issues. Paul, especially, goes to Mars Hill. He's no dummy. He's speaking their language and addressing their matters, but he's doing so directly, as you've written about, providing not only the denotation but the connotation. He's providing not only that Jesus died and rose again, but also what that means. And he's doing so not letting the culture control the message, but rather addressing or applying the eternal message, the once for all message of Christ into that culture. And I think there's a directionality to that. There's a primacy.
Mhm.
I'm lacking some words to describe what I'm trying to say, but it's a way, the gospel is not formed by the culture, but it impacts the culture. It forms the culture around it, creates the culture around it, rather than the other way around. And, that's just one contemporary example, but this stuff's been going on forever. This is exactly the same kind of stuff that we're talking about in 44
Yes.
with the Committee of Nine and the OPC. So again, these things aren't going away, but we need to be reminded of this stuff. So any final thoughts on that or additional thoughts?
Amen. No, well, I think you nailed it there at the end, that the scriptures provide the terms for its own relevance. And the best way of communicating it is unearthing its deepest structures, laying it bare, teaching it on its own terms, and then self-consciously and with great understanding and sensitivity, engaging those great world systems of philosophy and religion that oppose it, which is precisely what the Apostle Paul did in Acts 17. So, yeah, it's wonderful to see the gospel presented with that depth, rigor, sensitivity, and wisdom.
That's such a good passage. I think that's a good transition point into the subject matter of our booklet, Unfolding Redemption, exploring the history and order of salvation. You can find it online at reformedforum.org. We'll have a link to that in the episode description. Individual copies, $10. It costs so much to ship these, so we're just above breaking even when we ship individual copies. $10, but it's well worth it. But if you want to buy 10 and share with your friends or your people at church, we're going to be selling 10 packs for $50. So you'll save half off on buying 10, and we'd love to get these out and send more copies. So head on over to reformedforum.org, click the link in the episode description to get copies of this, and we'll talk about more of this toward the end of the episode. But Acts 17 is such an important passage in which Paul is addressing these philosophers, the people who like to spend all their day thinking and debating new ideas. They invite Paul to the hill because they thought he was a babbler. He's a weirdo. He's it's like today, if I went to Ann Arbor, Michigan to Zingerman's Deli, and you got a bunch of these progressives hanging around, maybe drinking some coffee, and you overhear somebody sharing some crazy, weird ideas. My wife and I were members of a co-op in Mount Airy, Pennsylvania. So that's a very progressive, liberal area. And we loved it. But it's part of that horseshoe where if you're far right, you start to meet back up with the far lefties, on the bottom of the horseshoe. And so you're into stuff like homeschooling and distrusting the government and like right, radical things. So anyway, My wife goes in to do some of these required hours, and she gave me reprieve because I'm studying. I have to spend all my time studying Hebrew vocab or something. So she's also doing my hours at the co-op. But they're whatever, unpacking boxes and stocking the shelves. And one of these really far out there left guys goes, "So you got any crazy liberal ideas?" And my wife said, "Well, some of the ideas I have might be so far right that they're too far left for you." So it's like the people on Mars Hill, over here, Paul talking in the marketplace, preaching the gospel, talking about dead people rising from the grave and what that means. And they say, "Hey, this is a guy that'd be great for our sessions. We got to invite him to our podcast." And so they go down to Paul and bring him up to Mars Hill. And Paul, certainly is not unaware of why they're inviting him, but will take every opportunity to preach the gospel in season and out of season, wherever he is, with whomever he is with. And he goes and he does so. But in doing so, he talks about and preaches this climactic event in history, the turning point in history, from the creation of the world, and at least since the fall into sin, which I have every reason to believe was pretty close to the creation of the world. Once the fall into sin happens, the turning point in all of history, we're talking many, many millennia, thousands of years now, is the death and resurrection of Christ, and what that means for humanity. Namely, well, really what it means for everybody, but especially those who trust in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, we're dealing with that in this booklet. We're considering the Historia Salutis, or the accomplishment of salvation, which not only includes the death and resurrection of Christ, but includes all sorts of saving acts of God in history. It could even include the giving of the law, the significance of that for progressing God's covenantal purposes. We have a whole fat chapter. Half the book is focused on Pentecost and what the giving of the Spirit means for God's progression, his advancement of his purposes in history. And then interfacing this accomplishment of salvation with the application of salvation. Murray called it redemption accomplished, redemption applied. We like that a lot. So we're building a ton on Murray. We're building quite a bit on Dr. Gaffin's work in Resurrection and Redemption, one of my favorite books of all time. And we're developing those themes and applying some in some new ways. So we have a heavy dose of Historia Salutis, the accomplishment of salvation, the importance of recognizing that, but then also looking at how that ought to inform our own personal experience of salvation, and how that also informs our understanding of the aspects of salvation, the benefits of union with Christ, which include our justification, adoption, sanctification, and glorification. So if you're interested in those things, this is a really important book, and I think people are going to appreciate it. And it's one of those things where I'm going to be hip, Lane. So I'm going to talk hipster style in the ETS circles. This might be a generative book, in the sense that it will spur you on to further thought, and I hope get you thinking about things in new ways. I don't know. What do you have to say, Lane? This is following up on our conversation. You taught a whole course on union with Christ. We sat down after that at episode 700. We recorded episode 700 on the heels of your teaching that course. And then, we thought we had something that's worth perpetuating. And took a while, but we eventually edited transcripts of that and reworked them over and over and over, and developed them, expanded the ideas into this book. So it doesn't read like a transcript. It's a booklet. Yeah. And it's something that'll, we hope, last for more than a few years. And that's a genuine contribution to the literature. There's nothing quite like this that exists. It's not that we're bringing ideas that have never been shared before, but we're taking a step since redemption accomplished and applied, and resurrection and redemption. And we're hoping that other people will take more steps as a result of reading it. So I, for one, am happy this is finally out, and that it arrived looking even better than I expected. which I had high expectations, and happy to share these ideas. But I know, for us, we've been talking about these things for so many years, but if I recall me coming to seminary and being introduced to the categories of Historia and Ordo Salutis, in many ways it was revolutionary.
Mhm.
Not that I had to throw everything out that I already knew, but coming to the table and being introduced to this idea that Jesus, his life, death, and resurrection, and his resurrection specifically was simultaneously, punctiliarly, his justification, adoption, sanctification, and glorification. It was like I was able to see everything in new light.
Yes, it's I would say what we've done, just by way of relating it to Murray and to Gaffin in particular, is that I think we stave off what at least recently have emerged as misunderstandings or misapplications of Gaffin's thesis. I'll just give you two examples. And here it's not to enter into long critiques and citations of multiple works or anything like that, but one thing that I think Gaffin maintained well in Resurrection and Redemption was the unchanging character of the divine person of the Son, and the mystery of how that immutable and living divine person suffered in an estate of humiliation and was raised and ascended into an estate of glorification without his person, divine person, being changed. Yet, at the same time, we would say of that person, with respect to his humanity, that he suffered and was glorified. And in that suffering and glory, in that fundamental movement from humiliation to exaltation, there are forensic declarations of adoption, forensic declarations of righteousness or justification, and declarations of death to sin and life to God. And I think we do at least try to maintain Christological or Catholic orthodoxy on the person of Christ, while benefiting, no pun intended, from the insights of Gaffin and staving off some contemporary movements toward a mutable person proper, where God in creation, God in incarnation is changing and developing. Try to stave that off. And then secondly, I think one thing we do that's useful is, especially in light of some recent concerns been raised in certain critiques of works that have been published in the last decade, there's a tendency among some, maybe even ostensible followers of Gaffin, to make a one-to-one correlation between Jesus' resurrection and the declaration he is Son of God in glory, Jesus' resurrection as being justified or vindicated, Jesus' resurrection with reference to his sanctification, dying to the world of sin and entering into life in the presence of God, and Jesus' glorification. You cannot draw a bare one-to-one correlation between what transpires in Jesus' death and resurrection and what transpires in the union of the believer to Jesus. And so I think we do we work hard. I hope we've done a good job of reminding people of the fundamental differences, even the difference in meaning between Jesus' resurrection with regard to his adoption, justification, sanctification, and glorification, and ours in him. The relationship is never perfectly univocal, but only analogical. And I think, without, we're trying to do this in a popular way without citing errors and things. I hope we will prove useful in maintaining the substance of what Murray and Gaffin gave us, and then safeguarding that from errors that have arisen in the past 15, 20 years.
Sure.
That's my hope.
Well, let's look at a few just offhand. Again, I have no notes. We talk about this a lot, and we've written this book. So I'm just going off the top of my head. And as I like to say, there's not much there. But so Jesus is justified in his resurrection, no doubt about it. So that's 1 Timothy 3:16.
Mm-hmm.
He's vindicated in the Spirit. But does Jesus, the person of Christ, need to be justified? The answer to that is no. What is then his justification? His declaration of his righteousness, his acquittal? Well, it's in part because sin is imputed to him. So, not in part, that's the reason. I mean, he could be declared acquitted because he always is righteous, but it becomes even more so necessary because he has taken our sin upon himself. So when he is raised from the dead, death being the wages of sin, he is exonerated. He's acquitted, openly acknowledged and acquitted. We too will be openly acknowledged and acquitted when we are raised from the dead, imperishable. You can see that on all sorts of places. Details included in the booklet.
Right.
Get your copy now.
Yeah, and one of the things that we emphasize in this volume and elsewhere, I believe we did it in our interview a couple years back, is that Jesus' resurrection as his justification or vindication, when we use that language, it's not the justification of the ungodly. It's not the justification, right, of someone who has personally violated God's law and is a transgressor. Instead, it's the vindication of the one who, though he knew no sin, became sin for us by bearing it as imputed to him in his suffering and
2
death
Corinthians
on the cross.
5.
Yeah. So this is one great example. We could talk about adoption and sanctification and glorification. This is one great example where this one-to-one correlation, where Jesus is justified and I am justified in Jesus, and these two are presented as somehow univocally, conceptually identical, that is so dangerous.
Right.
So there's a level of nuance and care that we need in this discussion. I believe Gaffin displayed it in large part. I think we've tried to advance and clarify a little bit more just to stave off misunderstandings. But this is a great, you pick that, that's a great example of how we need to be quite careful when we're using this language so that we don't blur or ironically conflate Historia and Ordo when we're so intent on distinguishing them. Right.
Yeah, I'd like for you to talk about Romans 1, 3, and 4, and the fact that in the resurrection, Christ was declared to be the Son of God in power. But before mentioning that, I think it's worth reiterating what you've already been saying, but I'd like to draw it out a little bit more specifically. The person of Christ is none other than the eternal Son of God. He never changes. We need to say that, and to say that we've said that before in previous episodes. We need to say that again. When the eternal Son of God assumes a human nature, he does not assume a human person. That is unorthodox, heterodox Christology. The person remains the same, but now the person of the Son, eternally begotten of the Father, from whom the Spirit eternally proceeds along with the Father, that eternal consubstantial person with the Father and the Spirit assumes a human nature, so that now we have one person with two natures, forever linked, forever united, yet always distinguished. This is this basic Christology that is affirmed in Nicene Creed, at Ephesus, and especially at Chalcedon or Chalcedon in 451. All right, so there should be no argument, no dispute about this in terms of a confessional, Orthodox, Catholic, small c, doctrine of Christ. This is Christianity. Things that are not this are sub-Christian or anti-Christian. There should be no dispute about this. And Catholics don't dispute this. Like, this is not a difference. This should not be something that we're trying to rehash or fix. All right. So this is nothing controversial about this. However, we have people that formulate certain things regarding the doctrine of God or regarding the doctrine of salvation, in which it presupposes that something changed with the person, or there is personal change. And when I'm using the word person here, I'm using it as a synonym to hypostasis. So again, another extension of an Orthodox Christology is that we affirm the hypostatic union, but we affirm that that union is anhypostatic and enhypostatic. So it gets both sides of things, that there is no self-existent personality, human person that the Son takes to himself. So that'd be kind of like a form of adoptionism. And that human nature has no personality apart from the hypostatic union, the union with the person, the hypostasis of the eternal Son. So we can only speak about a divine human person in that union. There is no two persons that united together in which the divine overtakes the human. There's any form of any permutation of error has been tried in the past and has been condemned. So that this is what we have in terms of basic Christology. There's a bunch of books on this we'd be happy to share with you. We have a Reformed Forum reading list on ancient church. J.N.D. Kelly's early Christian Doctrines is excellent on this, but there are many others on Orthodox and Catholic Christology and the development of that. Okay, laying all that down, when the Son takes to himself a human nature, the person of the Son does not change. Nevertheless, we sometimes speak of Jesus Christ, the God-man, and rightly so, in a way in which he does change. But that is an improper change. When we're speaking of change in terms of Jesus Christ, in terms of him growing, learning, and developing in his knowledge and wisdom, in his obedience, all these things, he grows and changes without sin. We're always and only ever speaking about his human nature changing. The divine person, which is the only person of the God-man, does not change. His human nature changes. So that now, with all that hopefully laid now at the foot, what does it mean, Lane, for Jesus Christ in his resurrection to be declared to be the Son of God in power? Because there truly is something different for the God-man post-resurrection than prior to the resurrection. So my question is, if it's not a change in his divine person, and certainly not a change in his divine nature, you can't speak of the nature or the person changing because it's one thing. What then changed? And then what does that have to do with us?
Yeah. Romans 1:3 makes a statement, 3a, that Paul's gospel is a gospel concerning God's Son. Gerhardus Voss, when he treats that, makes explicit, Pauline eschatology, that this pertains to the divine person of the Son of God. And of that person, Voss says in various places, I'll give a few quotes, a divine person who's immutable, is present from all eternity. He cannot be eradicated or changed. So what changes in him as he traverses from that estate defined as descending from David according to the flesh, an estate of humiliation, to being declared the Son of God in power by his resurrection from the dead? What is occurring in that movement? Well, the one thing that we have to say is that in his relation to creation and in his relation to his assumed humanity, the divine person does not change. Yet, what does he do? He enters into a new relation. And in that new relation, the relation can change, the creature in the relation changes, but the divine person remains immutable and living in that new relation. And I think this will prove helpful as we think about Romans 1, 3, and 4. Gerhardus Voss, in his Reformed Dogmatics, uses a parallel pattern of reasoning in RD 178 on the doctrine of God, and RD 349, Reformed Dogmatics 3, page 49, on the doctrine of Christ in the incarnation. And Voss says that when God entered into a new relation to creation, God remained essentially and personally immutable. There's a change in the relation. There's a change in the creature in the relation, but the self-contained and living triune God remains unchanged. And we really don't even need to distinguish between person and essence, because each person subsists as the undivided essence. So there's no change in God, the Son, in the new relation to creation. That's RD page 178. Now listen to what he says on page 49 of RD3. He says, the deity does not cease to be deity and is not in the least altered or changed by the incarnation. Hard stop. So what he's saying is that the divine person of the Son, the person is divine, the nature is divine. The deity of person and nature does not change in the least, is not altered in the least by the incarnation. And then he says, except insofar as it through the person has entered into a new relationship. Nor is it true that the humanity elevated on the supposition of eternity of the person, except insofar as it has entered into a new and entirely unique relationship. He says, the two spheres in which the person of the mediator moves lie next to each other, or one lies above the other, but they do not merge together. There is no change of the divine and the human as they're joined. The divine isn't made human. The human is not made divine. And so what is Voss saying? It's simple. It's really basic. That in the new relation to creation and incarnation, the divine person remains the same in a new relation. In the new relation to creation, in the new relation to an assumed humanity. How then do we describe the change in Romans 1, 3, and 4? It's so basic. The assumed humanity of Jesus, personalized in a permanent union with the divine person, undergoes a movement in redemptive history, in calendar time, from an estate of suffering culminating in death to an estate of glory beginning with resurrection and terminating in session at the right hand of God in resurrection power. And in that momentous transition, here's the locus of the mystery: an immutable, living, divine person takes to himself a true humanity, and that true humanity, hypostatically joined to that immutable person, undergoes a two-estate movement from suffering to glory, from humiliation to exaltation. And the locus of the mystery is that while the living and immutable divine person does not change, that true humanity, hypostatically joined to that immutable and living and divine person, changes, traverses estates, moves from humiliation to exaltation, and the locus of the mystery is right there. That's Voss. And that is, I think, the proper way to forge the parameters for the mystery that's set forth in Romans 1, verses 3 and 4. And one of these days, Camden, Lord willing, I'd like to spend some time in a course, examining that and probing it. But I think once we see that, we can see any kind of counterfeit that says, well, God takes new properties to himself when he creates. Trinitarian persons change in creation. Trinitarian persons change in covenantal condescension. Trinitarian persons change in the incarnation. That's mutualism. And I think we are avoiding that at the deepest level I know how, by following what Voss is saying about the immutable person of the mediator in his true union to his assumed humanity and in the traversing of two estates in that assumed humanity.
So what does that then mean for us, those who are not by nature heirs, having a full right to all the privileges of the sons of God, yet coming to have that through the person and work of Christ? How do we see ourselves, if not directly in Romans 1, 3 through 4 as a subject, but certainly as an object, as one who will inherit and receive that which is bestowed on the resurrected God-man?
Yeah. Having said all that, and I hope everyone appreciates why I took so long to say that. That needs to be said again and again and again, and I tried to give it all in 2 or 3 minutes. But if people are listening with their Bibles open, they have their Greek New Testaments out, and they're working through it and looking at it, right beside Romans 1, 3, and 4, see Romans 8:17, because here is the structure. Just as the immutable person of the Son traversed two estates in his assumed humanity, without that divine person changing, but with that true humanity being radically transformed in a movement from suffering to glory, by which he is declared the Son of God, is the heir of all of the promises that pertain to the Messiah. So likewise, when we are joined to him, the Lord confers upon us the filial right, which is forensic, it's not renovative, the filial right to a full inheritance in him. And how is that inheritance received? We are heirs, heirs of God, joint heirs with Christ, provided what? We suffer with him, Romans 1:3, the estate of humiliation, and are glorified together with him, Romans 1:4, the estate of exaltation. So what transpires in the life experience of the Son of God in his Adamic humanity as our federal head, namely a movement from suffering to glory, and in that glory entering into the fullness of the heavenly kingdom, inheriting the Father and the Spirit in the fullness of their presence in the heavenly kingdom. That reality is recapitulated and applied to sinners joined to him by the Holy Spirit through faith, so much so that we are heirs of God, Romans 8:17, as we are joint heirs with Jesus in this twofold movement of suffering and glory, which Paul will say in Romans 8:18 is a time of suffering in this age that gives way to a time of glory without suffering in the age to come. And so it's a wonderful way. Once you do what we just did, you can categorically distinguish the difference between Christ's person and the person of the believer. But then through his true human nature joined hypostatically to his divine person, and as he in that true humanity traverses those two estates to be declared the Son of God, the heir of all of God's promises as the great king, he confers the privileges and benefits of adoption, filial rights, on those joined to him by the Spirit and through faith. And when you do this, you can understand the absolute personal distinction between Jesus Christ and his church. Yet you can see the fullness of his solidarity with his people in his true assumed two estate traversing humanity. And it's quite beautiful, I think.
Yeah, the benefit of adoption is tremendous, and often I think overlooked, not addressed as much, certainly as justification, which was the center in many ways of the Protestant Reformation, at least its beginning. Sanctification we speak about in a variety of ways, talking about the importance of walking in a holy way and being liberated from the bondage of sin to be enabled to do that which is right and follow after God's law, and being energized to do that. But adoption having everything to do with receiving an inheritance and having a right to the privileges of the sons of God, just following here of the Westminsterian language, especially of the Shorter Catechism. But it's wonderful. Its benefits are tremendous. It's encouraging. And I like to put it this way. What does justification address? Well, we are guilty, but in our justification through Christ, we are not guilty. We not only are not guilty, but we are positively righteous because of his work. What does sanctification address? Well, we're corrupt, but in the work of Christ, by sanctification, in the irrevocable breach of the power of sin, in our death and resurrection in the new man, we are enabled now by the power of the Spirit to walk as children of light and to be holy ones. So we're no longer guilty, no longer corrupt. What is the problem that adoption solves? Well, in one sense, we're alienated from God. But now, through adoption, we've been brought into his family. And not just as visitors, but as people who are there as a true family member who has a right and full privilege of the house. We're sons. And that, in the Roman sense, in that culture, not just daughters, but having a right to the inheritance, full ownership, full privileges. And that is because of who Christ is, essentially and personally, eternally, but then also what he has done on our behalf to secure that and to be able then to bestow that upon us through his covenantal work. So glorification also addresses it too, but those are the key essential elements. And if you're interested in that kind of thing, you want to plumb the depths of that more, then we've got a little booklet for you, 52 pages. You'll breeze through it on the Lord's Day, and hopefully read it more times than that. But any final comments, Lane? If that doesn't encourage people, then I'd say that we need to consider your profession of faith.
Well, just a quick pastoral word, because there's an error that can be that needs to be avoided, especially on adoption. The Westminster Standards and Reformed theology historically, with a few outliers, but in the main, has been robustly affirmative that justification and adoption are acts of God. Justification changes judicial status. Adoption changes filial status. Sanctification is a work of God, and it changes your heart and renews you. Here's the pastoral thing to remember. It is dangerous to try to make either justification or adoption a renovative work, and here's why. Roman Catholicism with a merit system, Neo-Nomianism without a merit system, will always try to make your right standing before God, justification, the acquisition of your inheritance, adoption, in some way or another conditioned by and suspended on your renewed obedience. And if that's
produced by the Spirit, that's important, because even if this grace, and that's a Catholic view, that the grace that is produced in you, infused in you, your justification will hinge upon that. They will still see it as a grace.
Yes.
So it's not
Pelagian.
Not a Pelagian. It's not a work of yours in and of yourself, but it's still hinging your standing with God, before God, upon something produced in you, which that's what the Reformation was all about.
Yes.
It wasn't really, it's not just strictly the issue of sola gratia, because a Catholic would have no problem with sola gratia.
Of course.
The question is it an alien righteousness that is imputed to you, Christ? Well, the same needs to be maintained, as you're saying, for adoption. Is your inheritance dependent in any way on something inside of you?
That's right.
Or is it dependent exclusively on the person and work of Christ?
Right. Is it his meritorious obedience that grounds your right standing and secures your inheritance, or is it his obedience plus? And there are views, a number of them, that in one way or another reintroduce or either I won't say introduce a Catholicizing error or a neo-nomian error at the point of adoption. And so beware anyone who says that adoption is both a work, an act and a work, because to the extent that the person pushes that through, you're now rooting your inheritance on synergism, something Jesus does and something you do to complete it. And that is why the divines and why Reformed theology has always said no, both on justification and on adoption, to making it a renovative work that suspends righteousness or inheritance on something inwrought and that with which you comply.
Right. And, if you're interested in that, we deal with that in more detail in the booklet, but also speak about glorification and the resurrection, the consummation of a glorification. We're glorified already in the sense that we reveal the glory of Christ by his works within us, even in the inner man right now. But the full refulgence of that glory will be evident when we're raised imperishable, when he returns. When we see him, we will be like him. 1 John 3:2, we will bear openly the same attributes that Christ bore when he was resurrected, a la 1 Corinthians 15, about 45 and following. You can find out more information on that. But when we're raised from the dead, this is what you get kind of at the end of Romans 8. Yeah, we do see that we're sons of God in a new way. We do see that we're justified in a new way. We are our sanctification is revealed in a new way. But that resurrection is simultaneously an open acknowledgement and in a sense public declaration of our justification, adoption, and sanctification. But that revelation doesn't then change our justification to become renovative.
Absolutely.
And neither does it somehow change our adoption to become renovative or a work. Those are forensic activities. And our sanctification doesn't, nothing hinges upon God changing us in our hearts. Our sanctification is God's work in us.
Amen.
To make us more holy and conform us to the image of Christ in his death and resurrection. But neither our righteousness, our standing with God, nor our inheritance is suspended upon our sanctification. So that's why we can have a progressive sanctification, but we don't have a progressive justification. Certainly we don't have a progressive adoption.
That's right. Well said, brother.
Anyway, thank you. These are really great topics. We kind of had a part 1 and a part 2 today, but we're going to keep them together. So hopefully we hit something that you appreciated, either Machen and his continuing cultural relevance, or on Historia and Ordo Salutis, speaking about the booklet Unfolding Redemption, Exploring the History and Order of Salvation, available now, published by Reformed Forum. Head on over to reformedforum.org/store for more information there. There will be links in the episode description. You can get individual copies for $10 shipped anywhere in the U.S. and 10-pack. Just was working with Ryan. We'll have a 10-pack for $50 shipped. So that's half off. Working on finalizing ebook copies, which would include an EPUB as well as a PDF version, and getting that in the Kindle store as well. So that might be done by the time you hear this. If it is, there'll be links there as well. If not, you're going to want a copy of this anyway, because then you can give it to people. You can hand it out. You can write things in it. You could take notes. It's great. So these were available at the Reformed Forum Conference. We're glad to be able to put that into people's hands. And we hope we can put them into even more hands here through the online store. So with all that being said, take a look at everything we have going on the website. In addition to that, look for the recent lectures, the plenary addresses from the Reformed Forum Theology Conference, and other things that we continue to link to, including new courses that we have available. We've got just a million things going on. Scott Wright's new book on regeneration and redemptive history, that's available as well in the store, so you can pick that up while you're picking up Unfolding Redemption. But I'll leave it at that. And if you really want to know what we got going on, it's always best to subscribe to the email newsletter, which there's a form on the website for that as well. So I do want to thank everybody for listening. We hope you join us again next time on Christ the Center.